Okay, so my presentation is over the recovered memory / false memory controversy. So there are two contrasting positions in this controversy, but both of them focus a lot on childhood sexual abuse and if that would be false memory or if they were to recover it later on in life and just had suppressed it or forgotten it in the past. And there are two groups of researchers on both sides for false memory and recovered memory, and they both have their different opinions and have done different research on which one would be more accurate. Okay, so there are two contrasting positions for this. There's the recovered memory and the false memory. The recovered memory, this is usually memories that were forgotten or repressed from childhood, and then later they are recovered, usually in adolescence or adulthood. Children are more likely to forget than adults, and this is usually because they want to keep an attachment to their caregiver. They're more likely to forget this if the abuse is put on them by a family member or a close friend. So the false memory theory, it's also focused around childhood abuse mostly. And this is memories that are recovered or brought out later on in life that are just completely false, completely constructed stories that never happened but are believed to have happened by the patient or the person telling the story. So some of the arguments in the book for false memory theory, there was an experiment done where researchers they asked the participants to remember a list of words they had seen earlier, and they tested the accuracy of this, and 55% of the time, it was a false recall rate, which is a pretty high number. Some of the words on there that people were remembering were sleep and river, and these words weren't even on the list, so they were falsely thought up by these people. And there's a small percentage of people actually, though, who remember an event that didn't occur, so that's actually quite a small percentage relatively that the book talks about. So in the book, there are some good arguments for recovered memory. Some individuals actually never forget these traumatic injury or memories, and they remember them their whole lives without ever suppressing them. But some genuinely do. They don't recall the abuse for many years until they're adults or maybe in their adolescence. But indeed, some people do forget this abuse for many, many years, and they don't recall it for decades later. But there's been quite a bit of study done by researchers over this. But one of the main reasons that children are to forget these memories or suppress these memories are because the trauma that was put on them is by an adult, a family member, a trusted family friend, and they look to them for safety and protection, and they have this attachment to them. They depend on this adult, so they want to suppress these memories so they don't have fear towards them or hatred or anything. They want to keep their relationship with them. So I found some very interesting articles over these topics, and one of them is about, recovered memory, and it talks about how a lot of the memories come back from going to therapy, and this one focuses a lot on women and when they're adults and sometimes men even, but when they experience childhood sexual abuse or extreme physical abuse, they had no prior memories to this. They never thought anything wrong of their childhood, and then they might be going to therapy for something completely different, and they end up having these memories come back to them, and they recall them, and a lot of times this fractures whole families. And this article talks about how women who their abuse took place in infancy and maybe even until they were teenagers or young adults, and they recover these memories, these have broken families because these women and even sometimes men They just see their families as being very normal, very loving, and they find out that that wasn't the case their whole life, and that's very traumatizing for them. Sometimes these memories come back, and this would be more of like the false memory. Parents feel like they have been wrongly accused because these memories are coming back in children or even older adults or whatever, and they're coming back, and they're accusing their families, their parents, of these terrible acts, and these parents call these the false memory syndrome, and they sometimes even try and sue the therapist for planting these memories in their minds because they feel like they're wrongly accused and this never actually happened. And so this sometimes happens. Patients end up suing their families, or parents end up suing the therapist because they feel like they're being wrongly accused, and that these memories have been planted in their minds by the therapist, and that they were never there, and now the child or the adult or whoever is receiving the therapy is now having these memories that never actually happened, and they're pretty horrific memories. So a lot of times, like, families are broken, or someone ends up getting sued, just all kinds of terrible things. So this article also talks a lot about therapy and how therapists are a lot of times sued, or families are sued over the memories that are recalled. So therapists who treat patients who have suffered abuse are at considerable risk of lawsuit, and that's one of the main topics of this article, and how a lot of times therapists are afraid to work with people who have been through this trauma or help them recall this trauma, because a lot of times they could be sued. For example, there was a man suing a therapist, the therapist of his child, and this child ended up recalling these memories of abuse, and the judgment was made that the therapist was using leading techniques with the patient, and in the end they thought that this was falsely implanting these memories in their mind, and the father ended up receiving $500,000. So during this time, many therapists were less likely to believe the stories of abuse of their own patients, and they were afraid to work with them and help them, and they were just so worried, and a lot of patients were worried that their own therapist was going to turn against them for these things they had gone through and this trauma that they had gone through, and so they were less likely to talk to their therapist about it. So there are 5 stages of recovering memories. The first one is to recall the memory itself, find out what the memory is, recall it. The second one is to process the memory and just learn more about this memory, keep this memory in their mind. The third is to figure out if the victim wants to speak out about it, how they want to react about it, how they want to deal with this. And the fourth is to let them go ahead and do that. If they want to speak out, let them go ahead and do it. Figure out some communication for them. And the fifth and final stage is to believe this memory and hold it and keep it for them, and let them make sure that they don't forget it again, that they're able to keep this in their minds forever.